Hello, Facebook. Once again, joining you, Anthony Frisina, founder of Above and Beyond, Bridging the Gap to Accessibility and Inclusion, and Director of Media Relations for the Ontario Disability Coalition. And once again, joined by Maddy Dever. Maddy, how are you?
I am tired today. It's been a long 6-month journey culminating in yesterday's election, and I'm tired. But I'm Maddie Dever. I am an autistic adult and parent of 5 kids, of which 4 are also autistic. I'm also was in a car accident 2 years ago, and I'm a spinal cord injury and in a wheelchair, and I am tired today. I'm just tired. There's a lot more to me
Yeah.
than that, but you can always check out my website at autisticrambler.com to see all of the things that I say and
before
do.
we get into our conversation, specifically about inclusive education, Maddy, let's just give a recap of the election yesterday. How do we feel?
It I've been feeling for a while that um it was going to be um a, a PC victory. I had hoped that it would be a minority, even though I felt it wasn't going to be. And I'd been feeling for quite a while that the NDP and the Liberals were really running to be second place, not really running to win, um, because they just didn't seem to be offering anything for people to vote for. And I think the the thing that really shocked me and bothered me was the voter turnout. And it's the lowest voter turnout ever. I think it's 40 or 41%, depending on how you look at it. Um, 60% of people didn't vote. 60% of people didn't have a reason to vote. 60% of the people stayed home or had barriers preventing them from voting. And um, if 5% of people voted, stayed home, if 5% of those that stayed home because they didn't think their vote mattered actually voted, every one of their votes would have mattered. 10%, if 10% more people voted, which it would have put us to where we normally are at, around 50 to 52%, it would have changed completely the outcome of the election. So the biggest takeaway is, we need to figure out why people didn't vote and how to get them to vote in the future. Um, but yeah, we're ending up with, for people with disabilities, I think it's the worst outcome we could have asked for, and it's going to be a hard day today. It's a hard day. It's going to be a hard time for a while, as um, we really needed people to vote for us and our needs, and that didn't happen this election, which means it's going to be a harder journey to be an advocate, a harder journey to bring forth activism to bring change, than it would have been in any other scenario. So, um, for me today's the day I'm sort of exhausted, and I'm hanging. I Because I was expecting the outcome. I'm not as hit as other people are, but I'm exhausted, and I need to take a bit of a breather, and then get ready next week to start the advocacy journey. Um, that will the path to set the path we go on for the next 4 years. So that's my take on it.
And Maddie, what about COVID? Do you think COVID played a factor in the lower voter turnout?
Um, yeah, I think there's still a lot of people that don't want to go out anywhere, and I think a lot of people that perhaps weren't aware of all of the options they had to vote that could have kept them at home. We talked a little bit about this yesterday. Some of the things that Elections Ontario was adding to make it more accessible for people that I wasn't aware of until 2 days ago or 3 days ago now, that you weren't aware of until yesterday. So, um, I think there definitely could be some of that. It would be really important to analyze, you know, you know, out of that 60% that didn't vote, what was their reason? I mean, I can postulate reasons, and I think COVID is probably a strong one. Um, I think it just goes to show that you need um, people need to know. Elections Ontario really needs to make it very clear, and a big selling point, the ability to vote from home by mail, vote from home by having Elections Ontario come and visit you. If I think if people with disabilities or people with COVID or people with illness know about this, and it's a clear idea, it will probably increase some people ability to vote. There's a lot, there are a lot of barriers. I talked to a lot of people with disabilities yesterday, and some of them, like, it was a real chore to go vote. It was a real some of them voted at advanced polls and trying to make sure, like, figuring out where they're the right place to go, or just going out to vote yesterday. For people with disabilities, it is a challenge. It's not straightforward and easy as it might be for um, able-bodied people. Um, so, like, I think there's some of that, but there's also just it's frustrating when political parties try to tell you who to vote against instead of why you should vote for them. And it, this election, we had to really push to get parties to have policies that would support us, that would really support us. And I know so many people with disabilities felt a little disillusioned. And honestly, the expression, "Well, I don't know who to vote for. My vote won't count for anything because there's nobody to vote for." Or, "I don't know why I'd vote for that party because they're not going to win." Yeah, no, if you don't vote for somebody, yeah, no, they won't win. If everybody has that same attitude, they won't win. And it's, you know, we really need to change politics to be, you know, away from this attacking each other, hyper partisan, us versus them. I've just watched people over the last 4 or 5 weeks, because I mean I've been involved in a local campaign, so I'm hearing it daily, and the answer is, so much. "Oh, I'd like to vote for you, but you're not going to win." Well,
Yeah,
that attitude is significantly problematic.
no, I hear you, Maddie. And there's a lot of interaction happening in the chat from Sherry and Laura. Thanks for joining us. And we want to make this episode and our last two episodes a lot more interactive, from people in the chat talking to us. And Laura's coming to us from Halifax. And yeah, there are options. They are making it more and more accessible for the different ways to vote. But the communication of this, I think, is what was misleading and misunderstood. But Maddie, let's get into something. Uh, let's get into our topic for today.
Sure, absolutely.
Inclusive education. Where do we begin?
Inclusive.
Where do you thoughts, Maddie? Where do you want to start?
Okay, so the first thing I want to do is I want to clarify what inclusion means when it comes to a school setting. Um, I I've heard so many times teachers and teachers union and Ministry of Education talked about the fact that we have an inclusive education system. Um, so what we really have is an integrated school system. We have integration where people with disabilities and challenges, and I'm not going to use the word special education from this point onwards.
Yep.
But
That's tomorrow.
those of us with significant challenges that we need accommodations, we're in a regular classroom. Now, what makes something inclusive is if you're accommodated. If everyone in a classroom is accommodated, each of their unique needs are met in a way that will allow them to fully participate, only then do we have inclusion. Because if you have anything, any barriers to people participating, like for example, going on a field trip that is in a place that is not wheelchair accessible, um, but so that the rest of the class will go, but those who have the mobility challenges need to stay and do something else. That's not inclusion. That's exclusion.
Yep.
And if these exclusions keep happening, if an autistic child has some struggles and the sensory needs aren't there, and they're reacting to that because the needs aren't being met, um, the more and more exclusions happen, you end up having that child put into a different class, isolated. That's segregation, right? We have this slippery slope, because we're not looking at the needs of the child, and we're looking at the needs of the system. So inclusion means looking at every aspect of a classroom, whether it's elementary school, high school, or in college. You know, if we're if there are needs that are there, the the focus is on removing the barriers and making sure that there's accommodations for everyone. And that's a challenge, because that's not the way the school system looks at inclusion. They believe that once the child's in a classroom with other students, it's inclusive. They've included them. We need to get the wording correct, and we're going to talk tomorrow a lot about language of inclusion, which is much broader than this very specific narrow here. But we need to make sure that we're talking the same thing, because again, in the school system, inclusion
Yeah,
means something different, and we have to correct
absolutely.
that.
I do have to chime in, Maddie, with one thing as a disclaimer. We are having a major thunderstorm here in Hamilton. So if I do lose power and this live does go off, I apologize. I just wanted to get that out there because I'm a little bit paranoid about that.
So what
Um,
you're saying is that we may end up this live may end up having a blast.
exactly, exactly. So, so yeah, and Sean, to your point, people are people, and I just want to make that perfectly clear that no matter your designation, no matter your choices, no matter your um, race, ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation, people are people, and inclusive and including people is um, the first and foremost and most paramount of what we do and who we are as people. And we'll get into that language and conversation tomorrow. But inclusive education. Now, I'll speak from my end of it, Maddie.
Sure.
I went through the system of uh, having gone to an elementary school that wasn't wheelchair accessible. I was born with the ability to walk, and subsequently used a wheelchair from 12 years old there on after. And when I went back to the school to finish my last 2 years of grade 7 and 8, I was using they used the old school crawlers at the time, where my wheelchair was attached to this mechanism that crawled up and down stairs while I was attached to it. I mean, this was 1992, 93 for with my last 2 years of school. But to think about that at that time, and to think about things now, um, the efforts were there. Like the thought was there. The society, while still isn't there to this day, sometimes we often look at cost. Maddie, and you made this point earlier in the week about talking about investment versus cost. And that's really what it's about. It's you're investing in your people. You're investing in communities that have a lot to offer. And so, pardon me. Once I completed high school, or sorry, elementary school, it was then off to college, or sorry, high school, where the elevator was by priority, and you were given an elevator key. Now, I get it, but then I don't get it. I mean, an elevator is a tool that's a benefit for everybody. Uh, the fact that uh, they prioritize people with disabilities seems to be a little bit of a off-putting statement. What do you think on that, Maddie?
I hate every elevator that I have to have a key to use. Um, I mean, I've had mobility issues for the last 13, 14 years, but there was a year when I was 11, and I was in grade 7. Yeah. Um, and I had a condition called osgood-Schlatter syndrome where my legs grew, like one part of my legs grew faster than the other. I had a massive growth spurt. I think I grew 18 inches in like 6 or 7 months. And so my legs were locked, and I needed a crutches to get around everywhere. And it was really challenging because you've got all these peer issues. Um, I was also 2 to 3 years younger than everybody in my class. I went from being the end of the year. I went from being the runt to being the tallest kid in school. That was a weird experience, but the mobility wise, like getting around school, we had we had a one level school. Everything was flat, but it was just a massive maze, and I found that it was uh, it was difficult because everything was far away from each other. We had to go from one class in one side of the building to another class at the other end, um, and that was a significant challenge for me, as somebody who is like I was in crutches, but I was also in a lot of pain. So it was just, and you're aware of how different you are, as especially in middle school. It's like all of a sudden, you may have been different all of your life, but you become really different, and really noticeably different in grade 6, 7, and 8. Um, Schools aren't like they're not designed for people with disabilities. There's it's the thing I would say is that most things were not inclusive from the start. It didn't start that way. It started with, we have this much land. How are we going to use it to its best benefit? The
And,
the challenges and needs of the people that would use it weren't really, you know, they weren't really thought of. Like, what does the average person need? Well, that's what we're going to build it to.
and,
And
and how are we going to bring?
still, I mean, that for educational things, I find until the last 5 years, anything that was built did not take us into account.
Yeah, and that's actually what I was going to go into. Um, what aside from the infrastructure and the building of the land in the schools and whatnot, in your opinion, what was it like in the classroom in terms of the accommodations needed?
So, um, I, um, I- I'm going to talk about some of my issues, and I'm going to talk about some of my kids' issues. They're very similar. They're very similar. Sound, light, noise. Um, their rooms were very, when we were kids, we had really large class sizes. There was like 30, 35 kids in the class, everybody moving, everybody doing stuff. The lights were, those ceiling lights that emit really high frequency noise, and I could hear everything all of the time. And all it needed was, some loud bang or the fire alarm or something, and it would just set me off. And some kids have meltdowns, some kids have shutdowns. I was a kid that shut down. I was a kid that when these things happened, you couldn't talk to me, I couldn't communicate. um and I was like absolutely overwhelmed. And three of my kids, possibly four, um sound and massive changes in light, um they're all affected by it. And one of my kid has meltdowns, and the other two, mostly shutdowns. My youngest definitely is a shutdown. My son was definitely more of a, you never knew whether it was going to be a shutdown or a meltdown. And nowadays they're building, some rooms or sensory corners, or really trying to, look up ways of reducing lighting and reducing noise. Giving kids noise canceling headphones. I didn't have those as a kid. My gosh, I have AirPod Pros. 2 years ago, my sister let me try them, and all of a sudden, like, it knocked all of the sound out completely. It was like life changing. um, I if I had that as a kid, I probably would have been able to cope with things a lot better. And so, as a kid, there was no accommodations. No accommodations. I didn't get any accommodations until I was in grade 11, when I was allowed to take tests and exams by myself, instead of being in big rooms where I was just distracted by everything, and I just I could never finish things, even though I was really, 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 really bright. I couldn't show it. Once I was able to, you know, do it on a computer in a small room by myself, and I got everything done really fast. That was the only time I ever got accommodated. But I've been trying to fight, and there's the word that parents, the moment you have a parent of a child that's got some sort of need for accommodations, the school system is a fight, and a daily fight, because they're responsible for accommodating your child. They're responsible for having an inclusion plan, and they don't always get it. And they'll write it down and say, yes, this is what's necessary. And then something happens in the class, and they don't do it, and they say, well, we can't always do it. And yeah, so there's a big jump between, like, I remember my mom fighting for me and my brother and our needs. And I you know there was no accommodations. And then, me fighting for my kids. It's like the same exhaustion, but it's better, but it's still not there, because they don't really understand what inclusion means.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to that, and I'm going to give a not so great example, which is with very little um, information pertaining to like specifics. But in grade 9, for me, they had the three levels of basic, general, and advanced level learning.
Yeah.
And during one test, I was given the basic level test, the general level test, but the advanced level test was folded up, and I was told not to worry about it.
Mhm.
I didn't know this at the time, that it was the advanced level. I speculated. So I did what I was told. I did the basic level of the test, I did the general level of the test. And prior to handing the test in to the instructor, I looked into, to my amazement, it was the advanced level part of the test. So I handed it back to her, to them, as as they asked, and in my amazement and in shock that that I wasn't even given the opportunity
Mhm.
to do that part of the test. And I made it known to certain people within the school that this wasn't right. This was an inequity. I wasn't being treated fairly, uh, and for what I can only assume to be a presumption of something. But long story short, I was given the opportunity to do that part of the test at a later date and was successful. This wasn't anything to prove anything to anyone else, but to prove to myself,
Mhm.
um, that nobody's going to tell me or presume my ability.
Mhm.
Um, and then now, years later, we talk about the importance of education, and now we have the means to elevate, to amplify our strengths, Maddie, by way of: are you an auditory learner? Are you a visual learner? Do you learn
Mhm.
by mind mapping? Do you learn by brainstorming? Do you learn by video? Are you a writer? We have that mindset now under the Universal Design for Learning model
Mhm.
that states, however, your strength is to get to the answer, to get to the conclusion, please utilize that. And we
Mhm.
need to be more open and accepting of this inclusive education, universal design for learning model to have more autonomy, more agency, and not be confined. And I hate using that word confined to what the perceived norm was back in the day. We need to elevate. We need to be more forthright and being more accepting and inclusive. That the answer is what the most important message is. How we get to that answer, let's get to that answer based on our strengths as individuals, not
Yeah.
necessarily just people with disabilities,
Yeah.
but as individuals. What do you think?
Yeah. I watched my daughter. I have three daughters, and I they each come across getting to a math answer differently. One of my daughters is just she's got the answer, within a second. It doesn't really matter what it is. She just thinks it in her head and does it. I have another child that will think a little bit more, but give you an answer that's also good. And then I have another child that will think, get the right answer. And I would then, sometimes I ask, okay, how did you get to that? And the path that they get to the answer is so different. Like one of them just like it makes my head hurt how they got there. They got there, right? So that's the important thing. They got there. But it's like the path that they get there is so totally different. And I mean, we I think a lot of us who are a little bit older that were part of the streaming system, new math that the kids do these days, it just doesn't make sense to us because we were taught I think the shortest and quickest way to get to an answer. But the thing is, that's it's having like all of my kids learn differently the way they learn. My son, I taught him things by singing to him. I turned everything into a song and he would get it. If you spoke to him, you wouldn't necessarily get response. You wouldn't necessarily know if you got the answer, but singing to him and then him singing it back to me, you know it opened up pathways to teaching and response that I never expected. um, you talked about streaming, and I I despise streaming because it artificially limits who can do what. It sets people up for you know sort of tiers and levels and castes in society. It's like, well, if basic, Well, you're only going to be able to do this much. I forget what the middle one was, but like out of the three things, there was a pathway, and one was better than the other, and there was a difference in the way teachers treated you. There's a difference in the way your peers treated you, and so much bullying or just um, being you know who you would accept depended on where you were going to end up, right? And there is a real disdain in our age towards colleges. For okay, any Americans are watching here, when we say colleges, it's not the same. Colleges and universities are two different levels, two different types of institutions. So college isn't just everything after high school. Um, so college was something that it was definitely um, put down compared to university.
That you're less
And I
than.
remember my parents, because they both went to university, and they both taught at a college. They really were hyping up at university, university, university. The funny thing is, all three kids, me and my siblings, we all ended up going to college, the same college. We went to Algonquin College. Yay, Algonquin. Um, and I've now had two, some of my kids, you know, have gone to Algonquin in college. I used to think that because of the way I grew up and because of this expectation, and this is all really, there's a thread of inclusion in all this, right? Because when you put people in pathways, right? When you put people in, because of your expectations, you're only going to let them do this, right? Um, you tie people to this. Uh, you make it harder. You put the barriers to other aspects of society, other aspects of living, because you don't have the skills or you don't have the prerequisites to um, to do more than what you've been told. To step up, to excel. And I'm going to talk about this a lot tomorrow. The expectations and labels and all that kind of
Yep.
stuff. You know, um, when we're given a label, when we're given an understanding based on what's expected of those of us like this, it creates real challenges. We're not seen for the other things we can do. Like, we are struggling in this area. I mean, I don't know what it is, but the moment people see, the moment some people see you in a wheelchair, they automatically think that you can't do a lot of other things. Like,
Yep.
it doesn't matter whether, like, I can speak eloquently, but they'll still think I'm significantly challenged, um, because my body is broken. Their words. I've had that people tell me that I'm so sorry that your
Yep.
body is so broken. It's like there's a
And
mind
Maddie,
there.
there's so much to unpack there.
Yeah.
Um, Often the road less traveled is the road to prosperity. Is really kind of the takeaway. One of the takeaways from your share. Now, it's mind-boggling that perception of college, because I went to college as well. I had that same
Mhm.
conversation about, well, if you don't go to university, you're inferior, and that's not the case at all.
Yeah.
Um, College, you get more of a, I guess, a hands-on approach
Hmm.
that you don't get from a textbook,
Correct.
and I think part and parcel to what we're doing here, Maddie, with our lives this week, is giving lived experiences throughout the course of the week that are not often found in textbooks.
Hmm.
We spoke earlier about the different ways of getting to an answer and how that must be more elevated
Hmm.
in the sense that the answer is the answer. The destination
Hmm.
is really in the power of the individual to get uh, to the end of their journey.
Hmm.
Um, so then, Maddie, where do you see things evolving.
Sure. Okay. One of the things that really needs to happen, you know, we need to look at inclusion first, inclusive
Mhm.
from the start. We need to start with, okay, we will accommodate, we can accommodate whatever the needs are. Our job as educators, our job as a system is to remove the barriers. If we see a need, we find the way to make the need happen. And we don't what we have right now is inclusion as a goal. And when something's a goal, you know and systems are involved, it's what you'd like to happen instead of what's going to happen. Now, they're building an inclusive first system is not impossible, because there are places in Canada that are doing it. Nova Scotia, about 10, 13 years ago, um, they redid their curriculum and their whole education system to be inclusive first. Their job is to find ways that everybody is together and everyone is accommodated. And exclusion, taking kids out of that environment, is a really rare thing. You have to be absolutely you know show that there's no way to meet a need particularly inclusively. So exclusions are the rare thing instead of inclusion being the rare thing. It's an attitude shift. That's what it is. It's empowering teachers to find new ways of meeting kids' needs. It's empowering, and giving teachers, um, you know helping them. Like, so many teachers and other educators are overwhelmed right now. So one of the things that is overwhelming for kids and teachers is large class sizes. We really need to find the ways to, um, make classrooms with universal design. Teach teachers, give them the skills to look beyond, um, look beyond what is there. Okay, sorry, Lion King, 1.5 there. Um, uh, it, it's really, you know getting, with all new teachers, and ingraining this idea that they can help, they can do things, they can stretch the boundaries of what they know. The most important thing is meeting kids' needs. And their labels, they might help, identify types of things that might help, but it's the needs that matter. We need to look at needs and meet them. Just change. It's not a money thing, although sometimes there's some things that will help. It's an attitude shift. We need to believe that we can make changes to meet kids' needs. And when we
Yeah.
do that, everybody wins.
And inclusion is true inclusion when we don't question somebody's presence, only their absence.
Exactly.
Because the environment, the society, the attitudinal barriers, the educational barriers are not where they need to be.
Yeah.
It's and it continues on to this day. It's this there's this importance of accommodations. Accommodations are not necessarily inclusion. Accommodations don't necessarily level the playing field. They allow for those who require those accommodations to be of a greater success in the education environment. You spoke about it earlier, Maddie. Like being part of the solution, entering and exiting the building. We've had this conversation earlier in the week. Entering and exiting a building, being part of an inclusive classroom, having your strengths magnified and amplified to where you can be equally as part of the environment
Mhm.
as anybody else. It's just about having people's strengths up in this environment, Maddie, where we're trying to be more inclusive, we're trying to be more accessible. Um, where I think I said this earlier, but where do we go? Like, how do we change the system? Because we've spoken about a lot of broken systems. How
Mhm.
do we rip the band-aid off and be inclusive from the start? And how do we maintain that and sustain that?
Yeah. Um, so it's easier in colleges. My experience at college, I didn't go right after school. I opened a computer store right after high school, and then went into IT, built my life, and then after I got uh, sick 13 years ago, I went back to college in 2015, and finally went to college. So I no longer have nightmares about not going, staying in high school and not graduating. Those are gone. But the college I went to, Algonquin, um, like it was your accommodations were your rights. So if at the start of start of a year, there's this whole department that is to help with accommodations and accessibility. So you go in, you meet, you tell them what your needs are, you tell them what your challenges have been, and then they write accommodation letters that you give to your teachers at the beginning of every class, every session. And you don't the accommodation letters don't say what your condition or your illness or anything is. It just tells you what your needs are, and they're expected to meet those. That was like compared to the struggles I had in high school and the struggles I have with my kids in their school. That was light and day. That's and I I talked to a lot of people at different colleges in Ontario, and that mentality is there. I mean, I can't speak to universities because I never went, but how do we get there? How do we get to that goal? I mean, there's the challenge is the way our education system works in Ontario. You have school boards, schools, unions, and then you have the Ministry of Education. And I've been focusing the last 3 years of my life doing a lot of work with the Ministry of Education, and I've been seeing some success in the way they're looking at um, they're looking at accommodations and inclusion and trying to change the language. The problem is in Ontario, the Ministry of Education has no teeth. The Education Act has no teeth. So individual school boards decide how they're going to do things, and they decide their accessibility and their accommodations programs. They decide what supports they'll provide kids, and it's 72 different school boards, 72 different ways. So it's more challenging, but we still need to reach out to them. Every school board has a special education advisory committee, SEAC. Go there, go to one of the meetings. Write to them, write to the superintendent. You know, if you have needs for your kids, it's important to try to raise them. But I have seen better results when we look at challenging systems. It may be more daunting, but I have seen much more reward when I go up a level and I try to change if I'm being told that my kid can't have a particular support because they just don't offer that support for, my kids, yet I know that other school boards, with the same needs provide that support, you know, going to the school board and fighting to change that is easier than trying to convince the super, whoever's responsible for my child. The one thing I've learned many things, but one of the things that I've learned is that you're always starting from a no. You can never get worse than the no that you have. And if you're persistent, you can change a no to a maybe and a maybe to a yes. I mean, that's how I advocate. And other people, activism is more in line. Other people, it's just too daunting and hard. But I have found that when I start with the thing that I have nothing to lose because I already have a no. You know, I can go and try to, you know, advocate at a higher level. And for me, it's easier for me to advocate for my kids than it is for me. I think we've talked about it. I don't call myself a self advocate. I, I, I have self advocacy is one of my hardest challenges. I do not have the strength to advocate for myself. However, for other people, for all of us with people with disabilities, fighting systems, challenging systems, talking to the politicians behind those things. Um, yeah, it's challenging.
Yep. And
It's daunting because we've been dealing with the same issues
it's
for
exhausting.
decades. Yeah, it's exhausting. It really is. And for people who are parents, the school system is the domino that can take out the ability for kids to function in many other situations. If things are going badly at school, because you're not meeting your accommodations, it that changes a child and it changes a family because they're having to fight, and it's exhausting. So
And what you're referring to, Maddie, is an individualized education plan, an
exactly, yeah,
IEP for
yeah.
short, just
Sorry,
to and let our viewers know. And essentially, it is a legally binding agreement between the school, the case manager, yourself, the instructors. It's a law binding agreement that the instructor has the obligation to provide the student with the accommodated needs as illustrated on the IEP. And that's where the semblance of language comes in. Well, there's this presumption, oh, you need this, well, why do you need that? And it's as if the instructor is burdened in a sense to have to do this extra work for
yeah,
certain students behind that because of what the IEP requires.
yep,
Now, that's a huge stigma that really needs to be addressed. It's a huge stigma that really needs to be understood, eradicated, and educated upon. Really, I mean, we are talking
yeah,
about inclusive education today, uh, and why that's there. You don't need to know the meat and potatoes behind the individual, but you do need to know the meat and potatoes with what's written on the IEP.
yeah,
And I've seen it firsthand where an IEP was questioned, wasn't accounted for, and
yeah,
it boggles my mind why and how this still exists.
yeah.
Just quick before you respond, Maddie. The chat's going great today. Laura, thank you so much for joining. We have Janet in the chat, Kevin. We've got Sean, Sherry. All this great. This chat's great. Maddie, what are your thoughts?
So yeah, IP is a legally binding document that requires the schools to provide the accommodations therein. However, in many cases, it's not followed. And I know in the cases of my kids, every time there would be an issue that came at school, an issue that of why my child was struggling at something, and I would go back to the IEP. Well, was this done? And said, well, we can't always do it, or it's just not possible, or I thought there was a better way. And it's like when we have these IEP meetings and everybody seems, we're like we're going through everything, we're listing what's necessary, and there seems to be agreement. You know, like I've been for 20 years, I've been fighting schools because they don't follow the IEP, um, or they don't follow it always, and it's it requires an attitude shift, and that's the biggest thing. If you feel that if you feel the IEP is a burden, you are going to treat the child that requires these things as a burden. And when you do that more and more, you get burnout, both as a teacher and the students will burn out. If their needs aren't met, if anybody's needs aren't met, you can't be at peak um, when your needs when people are ignoring your needs or they're doing things that aren't helpful to you. And as kids get older, it becomes they begin to feel and internalize this, and you either get more in quotes behavior issues, or you get kids with mental health challenges that were really happy-go-lucky kids. And I know with my kids, um, uh, girls have a really hard time as it is in grade 5, 6, 7, and 8. All of their peers, they all are changing, things are different, cliques are forming, and everybody's aware of people that are different. And um, the, the gap between you and your peers becomes insurmountable. So when you get teachers not following IEPs, not supporting you, you're like you don't feel that you're supported at all anywhere. And some kids will act out in school, some kids will just be harder to deal with at home, and it's all because the needs aren't met. uh, it's all it takes is one teacher looking at a kid's needs and meeting them and trying to make sure that and their mental health needs are are just as important as their academic needs. If a child is if things aren't going well, you know it's it's up to the adult in the room. It's always up to the adult in the room to make the accommodations to change the environment so that the children are able to function and thrive. If you change the environment and kids are stable, they learn how to adapt to the small things that are in their way. But when their needs aren't met and the challenges are everywhere, everything begins to break down and it's harder and harder. Now, this is the case with whether it's physical disabilities or whether it's invisible disabilities. If your needs aren't met and you're struggling, right? If your class keeps going on field trips that you can't go on because of any of your disabilities, it's really hard for you. So it's really one of the things that I'm part of Echo Ontario Autism, which we're this past year we've actually been working with educators to from a multidisciplinary talk to them and teach them some give them some tools on how to work with autistic kids as well as any other kids with other developmental disabilities. And it's like opening their eyes to things that they hadn't thought through. you know there are many educators that want to learn how to adapt, how to create universal classrooms and universal design classrooms. Th- we need to foster this in teachers college. We need to encourage and teach younger teachers at, right now. It's harder for some teachers who've been around for a while and are burnt out. Changing ways when things haven't worked is hard, but it's it's patience, it's advocating at a higher level and trying to find a way to change the system itself. It worked in
It's
Nova Scotia. They had
yeah,
groundbreaking changes, so I know it can happen here.
yeah. My friend Laura in the chat is from Nova Scotia, from Halifax, and she's very active in the chat. So we appreciate that, Laura. But the one thing I wanted just to mention, Maddie, is, and I'm foreshadowing for tomorrow, but it's not about special needs, it's about human needs. It's
Yep.
about the tangible and intangible classroom and environment that we can uh, convey. The fact that for the last couple of years we've been doing a lot of things as a hybrid style.
Mhm.
The fact that there's opportunity to teach both in the classroom and virtually
Mhm.
is of the utmost benefit and really does help amplify inclusion. Before we finish, Maddie, if anybody has any questions for us in the chat, feel free to shout it out, and we'll do our best to answer. Maddie, this has been a lot of fun this week. This has
Yes.
really been a lot of eye-opening experiences, and I hope that our videos this week have really uh, been beneficial. Let's see. Anything happening? Questions in the chat? Not quite seeing any, but a lot of activity, which is great.
Mhm.
So Maddie, again, tomorrow we are talking about conversation, communication, language. Um, Thank you, Laura, for joining, and thank you everybody for joining. So tomorrow we are talking about inclusive or language and communication. What uh, what can our viewers expect?
um,
That's a tease.
you can, yes, you can expect that. We'll talk about, um, really changing the words we use away from a medical model which looks at everything as deficits, disorders, being broken, and moving towards a real strength-based way of talking about disability and the social model, and reiterating that it's not the label that you may be given to describe your to describe yourself is less important than the needs that you have, and the needs is what we need to focus on. So yeah, hopefully tomorrow is going to be a real positive, real fire and brimstone kind of chat.
Yeah, absolutely, and I can feel the enthusiasm of what tomorrow's conversation might bring. Maddie, we do have a question in the chat.
All right.
What's the next step in advocating your rights for people with disabilities with the provincial government?
So there's um inside of school systems, there's a process of appealing things, and if that doesn't work, there's two ways you can go. Well, three ways. One, take it to human rights. Take it to the human rights, and uh, advocate that the situation you have for your child is that they're not meeting their obligations to accommodate her or them. I don't know why I said her, but um, the second way, is a public way. Making a big, getting media involved and telling your story. And when you do that, what's important is that you have a defined problem, a very clear problem, a clear solution that should be used, and then your story of what's how your child's needs aren't being met. What's the story? Media will go with that, and it's also helpful when you're trying to convince politicians, whether it's school board officials, or provincial politicians. A clear solution is very helpful, and advocating at the political level, meeting with trustees, meeting with provincial politicians, meeting it can be challenging, but people are successful with any of those three ways.
Yeah, Maddie, and I know we talked about some announcements that we want to make. Do we want to make those announcements, Maddie, today, or did we
Well,
want to
let's
save them
finish it
for
off
tomorrow?
with it tomorrow. Let's
What's that?
yeah, let's keep people going. It's like, yes, it's an announcement. Yeah, we
Yeah,
can. Yeah, I think
yeah,
we've talked a lot today,
yeah.
and I
We
think
have.
tomorrow
Let's
tomorrow
finish
is
off our big announcements for tomorrow, Maddie. This has been a lot of fun once again. Thank you for joining us. And yes, Angela, yes, Special Education Advisory Council. The term special really irks me, but more tomorrow on communication and language. Have a great night, everybody.
Bye-bye.